QSO Today, episode 394, Robin Critchell, WA6CDR. My thanks to ICOM America for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. Robin Critchell, WA6CDR, was one of my ham radio Elmers and had a profound influence on me and many other young hams operating in the VHF and UHF space in Southern California in the 70s and 80s. He and Alan Burgstahler, WA6AWD, created the Cactus Intertie, probably now the world's largest full duplex radio-linked amateur radio network. Top Band, or 160 meters, is Robin's favorite band. He has participated on DxExpeditions, had an incredible career in the communications industry, and can fix just about anything. WA6CDR is my QSO Today. WA6CDR, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Robin?
4Z1UG, WA6CDR. I'm here and interested in talking with you for a while.
Robin, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
The truth of the matter is my father was searching desperately for something to interest a young teenager to keep him from going completely nuts. And my father was W6IHP. Actually, he was W2HPK originally. He's been licensed for many years at that point. And so he built up a station, and that was in the era when you built things. So he built up a station and played with it for a little while, and then he bought a Viking Ranger and an HQ-140 and set them up as a station. And I ended up with those as a teenager and was able to move along because that's in the era when you had a novice license and so on. But as my dad was why I got interested in ham radio, and he somewhat regretted it over the years because I'm one of those people that doesn't do anything by halves when I dive in head first and deep. So I lived, ate, and breathed ham radio for many years after that. And it actually, in the long term, paid me pretty well.
So, Robin, what was your father's name? Okay.
My dad's Howard, W6IHP. And he passed away in 2016.
He lived to be quite an old man.
Oh, yes, very definitely.
Uh-huh.
Interestingly enough, my mother is still alive at 101. But he got me interested in being the somewhat adventuresome type. I wasn't very good socially. CW and voice to some degree, but CW interested me because it's very much less personalized. You can't really tell much about the person on the other end that you don't hear from the CW. And I was active as a novice on novice frequencies, and then finally got my general in 1959 or thereabouts.
So the novice at that time was 1 year, right? So you had to either upgrade or lose it.
You had to upgrade to something, and the technician wasn't particularly a useful license at that point in the era of licensing. So I went ahead and took my general. It actually took me 2 trips. You had to actually physically go to the FCC at 849 South Broadway in downtown LA to take the examination. The novice test could be administered by somebody at that time. I think my dad gave me the test, but oddly enough, it was the code speed that got me the first time, because I recall this, that they did commercial exams on Tuesdays and Thursdays and ham exams on Wednesdays. And I remember the machine that sent the CW was a physical tape machine. You could hear the machine clicking and clacking as it read the tape, and you can hear the clock speed and so on. And somebody came in that hadn't needed their commercial license, but it was on a Wednesday, and I heard her go over and turn the knob on the speed knob on the machine. Yep. I heard her turn the knob on the machine, and it's from, I presume, from 13 to 15. And that cost me a second trip, which is interesting because I've always been interested in CW. So we got over that hurdle, and the first day I was a general. There's switches on the radio that said 160 meters, and I said, I don't know what's going on there. So I figured out how to make an antenna absorb some energy at that frequency, and not on 160 meters. So the first day I was a licensed general, and there's long stories associated with all that we can get into if there's any time. But I spent a lot of time being interested in 160 meters.
What was your father's profession?
He's an airline pilot.
Really?
He flew for Western Airlines for 15 years or so. He and my mother both flew in World War. Both were in the ferry command. They shuttled airplanes around the country to take them to the place where they had to get on the boat to be hauled to wherever the war theater was. And they met in liberal Kansas, of all places, I think. And that's an interesting career. My dad learned to fly in the military, but my mother actually was a licensed pilot and was training. She had progressed far enough to be a licensed instructor. She was training military pilots in the early portions of World War II, and she started flying in 1936, I think.
What's your mother's name?
Iris Critchell.
And what was her profession after the war?
Flying. It's complicated, but they did flight operations of one sort or another. She did quite a bit of instructing not long after World War II. And then my dad was an air traffic controller for a little while, but then he went to work for flying for Western Airlines. And then my mother continued on doing that. She was part of the 99s and the AWTAR air race and was heavily involved in that for many years. And in 1962, there's an extremely long story associated with that. In 1962, we moved to Claremont, and they started up the Bates Foundation for Aeronautical Education at Harvey Mudd College, and taught a whole lot of students not just how to steer an airplane, but why, and so on. They the foundation gave them 2 years of high-grade training. A lot of them turned out to go to do well in the aeronautical world. 2 of her students were astronauts, and many of them are heavily involved in the aerospace world still today.
That's quite interesting. Your mother has an interest in meteorology?
Oh, yes. She has a degree from USC in meteorology, which is an interesting combination. There was a flight training program at USC. I'd have to go dig through the details, and she got her degree from USC in the physics of meteorology, which was rather unusual for a woman in that era. And so she's always been the weather expert. And that was way before you could pick up your cell phone and punch a few buttons and get a satellite overview of the weather or a composite radar view of what's going on and so on. They were still using ships and radiosonides and all kinds of things like that to try to collect enough information about the weather. This is pre-satellite and way pre-satellite. You had to be able to interpret the information that you got and turn it into a pretty comprehensive picture without actually being able to stare down from 22,000 miles through a camera. It's quite an operation to do all of that. So the 2 of them ran the Bates Foundation there for 25 years at Harvey Mudd, and part of what she was teaching was meteorology, because a good pilot needs to understand the weather, not just simply that there is some. And that kept them firmly occupied and kept me occupied through my teenage years with 160 meter things. And it did a little bit on 2 meters, not very much. I was on 2 meters some. And I was just thinking about this. I'm not sure what the triggering event was that got me to UHF, to 400 megahertz. I can't remember the triggering event, the availability of surplus radios, I think, as I had been fairly active on 160 meters all through my teenage years. And when I graduated from high school, I went to Cal Poly for a little while. I never did get along with school all that well. And I snagged a job with General Dynamics for a year and a half, fixing test equipment. That's what they had, that big General Dynamics plant there in Pomona. And then I went to work for McFarland Communications, which is a Motorola two-way radio communication shop. And fundamentally, at that point, the rest is history, because that was the transition point to move me into UHF activities.
Was your mom, was she a ham as well?
No, my mom never did get her ham license. That amused me a little bit. We did a lot of family flying in the summertime, and one of the jobs you have to do as a pilot, especially in that era, because the navigation systems are not as automated as they are today. No computers running them, so you dial into one of the navigation aids, a VOR, and it transmits in MCW, Morse code. It transmits its identification. And she had to pay attention to the Morse code identification and listen to it carefully to make sure that it's identified correctly. And I just said, no, it's this. And because at that point in my life, Morse code was a second language to me. And I heard it and I knew what it was. It's interesting. The low frequency ranges and the VOR, VHF Omni range, is what that's called, all identified in MCW. But she never got a license. And my dad was really never active as a ham. Once he pushed the ham start button in my world, he never really got much involved in ham radio activities from that point on. And they were working the equivalent of 80-hour weeks for 30 years running the Bates program. They didn't have a lot of extraneous time, and their interest was aviation and not ham radio.
Did you become a pilot as well?
No, oddly enough. I actually have a logbook and some time, but I didn't choose to follow the discipline to the point where I would actually complete that. I know that's been a disappointment to my mother, but it was the right decision for me.
Now, you said that you attended Cal Poly Pomona.
Yeah.
I know a large number of hams in your circle, and probably also the Venn diagram, it crosses into my circle as well, who started university and ended up not finishing. Or I finished in something completely outside of technology because I couldn't do differential equations to save my life. But did that make a difference in terms of the way you chose your career path?
I don't really know. Excuse me. Just in thinking back through it, I was pretty well steeped in ham radio activities at that point. I'm not sure if I had been willing to exert the discipline necessary to complete 4 years. It would have been in engineering, electrical engineering in one form or another. If I had the discipline to complete 4 years in that, I might have done something a little bit different. But I found a way to very firmly occupy that period of time with the things I was interested in and seemed to be able to at least do. So I don't think so. The exposure, I didn't get along with school very well at all. That was one of the reasons my dad, searching desperately for something to occupy me, was not a good student and didn't want to be. And that made it very difficult to move me into any of the normal academic paths. I met a number of people that I still know from the Cal Poly days, and Cal Poly had a ham club, and we worked on a radio there and various and sundry things like that. I climbed the old CHP tower on Kellogg Hill and trimmed the low band ground plane down 2 meters, and that tower had been not abandoned, but it was functionally deeded over to the radio club to use, and we did some stuff there. I don't remember whether we ever made a 2-meter repeater out of it, but it got used. But my technical growth was focusing on radios and making them work. My first job with the McFarland Communications was putting all the parts in the base station radios and mobile radios to convert them from wideband to narrowband. In that era, from wideband to narrowband is from 15 kilohertz deviation down to 5 kilohertz deviation. And the conversion was moderately complex. The base station radios took several hours, and you took the radio apart, took coils out of the receiver, and put different parts around the discriminator coil and put it back together again. It was a very involved process. And oddly enough, the economics did drive that, because the two-pipe radios, the radio itself was expensive compared to the cost of paying somebody to sit there and put a bunch of parts in it and make it work as a narrowband radio with adequate stability and all the rest of the things that you need to do to make a radio behave itself. And that was my first job with them, was dealing with narrowbanding things, and then did a little bit of bench work, and they started me on field work. And all the time I was able to see and read and understand the schematics. And so it was a domino process. The more I did, the more I learned, the more I did. And my ham radio activities ran right in parallel. I ate, slept, and drank two-way radio mobile communications for the next 20 years, very nearly 20 years anyway.
Well, I think I remember those years, actually. And there were a lot of hams in the mobile radio business in Southern California in those days.
Oh, yes, very definitely. Quite a number of them, and not necessarily all in just working at a two-way radio shop like I was. A number of them worked for major facilities of one sort or another. I even ended up that way. And a number of them worked for utilities. And Edison had a large group of hams, many of them with degrees from Cal Poly. And I worked for Macomco for 14 years, and then the call for more technical people and more money was more than they could deal with. So I ended up working for KCBS Channel 2, doing functionally two-way radios, but including the broadcast plant for the next 25 years. And that kept me in the continuous occupancy world of two-way radios. But the oddity in all of that is that my interest in 160 meters was minimized a little bit by the circumstances and the timing, but it never went away. And every time I had an opportunity, I did something on 160. So I became somebody that focused on 160 meters and 440 megahertz ham activities.
The 160 meter thing is interesting to me, and the reason is because 160 meters, at least it seemed to me in Southern California, there was a very high noise floor, and antennas were unusually huge. So if you lived on a postage stamp size lot in Southern California, it seemed to me that would be a very difficult band to appreciate. Why did you appreciate 160 meters?
Because it was different and a challenge. It was another switch position on the radio, and I said, "What is this?" And then the bug bit. If you've never really gotten involved in 160 activities, then you don't quite realize how bad a unique bug it is, because 160 meters is a very unique band with very unique characteristics, both antennas, noise, propagation characteristics, when it works, why it works, and how it works is totally different than everything else. It's even drastically different than 75-80 meters. And I was, as I said, I was on 160 meters the first day that I had a general license. One of the people I worked with was Herbert Hoover Jr., W6ZH up in Santa Barbara. But that wasn't the inspiration. It was something there was interesting. And I talked to people. And this is, you remember the tubular. I worked hams in the local area, several of them who operated 160 mobile, and I got more and more involved. And I participated in the first CQ 160 CW contest, the very first year that it happened. Stu Perry, W1BB, was the functional sponsor of it. It ended up being a CQ contest. And stretching the capabilities and stretching the performance was very interesting. In that era, I won't waste a whole bunch of time on that, but the band didn't look anything like it does today. We're still 1.8 to 2 megahertz, except that we only had little tiny segments. Low-RAN still occupied the band. There was low-RAN at 1850, 1900, and 1950 kilohertz in different parts of the country, and those transmissions were noisy pulse transmissions that were at least 50 kilohertz wide. And in that era, and especially being the type of device that it was for navigation, they didn't worry too much about whether the edges of the pulses went out and bothered the hams or not. We were restricted to basically the top and bottom 25 kilohertz. The East Coast had the bottom 25 kilohertz. The West Coast had the top 25 kilohertz. And we were, in many areas were restricted. That was when radios were rated in input power. We were allowed 500 watts in the daytime and 200 watts at night. Some parts of the country were not allowed more than 50 watts at night. And it made just talking from the East Coast to the West Coast a significant challenge. And yes, if you had a great big huge antenna system, you could do pretty well. But we were all learning about what it took, and we're still learning. I still follow 160 things.
What was the antenna that you used as that first antenna?
When I lived up on Palos Verdes, and it's one of the places that my dad regretted it. It had a Spanish tile roof, and I made hundreds of trips across that roof. And while I didn't break very many of the tiles, I knocked all of the concrete at the tile connections loose. So the whole roof was just loose from hundreds and hundreds of trips of a teenager running across the roof to fiddle with the antenna. I made out of EMT and tank whip. I have a 25-foot tank whip and a bunch of EMT. I made a 55-foot vertical with a loading coil and used the house water pipes as the ground system. I threw out a couple of radials around, but it was a city lot. We're not talking about anywhere with a lot of space. Fortunately, the power was underground there, come to think of it, I'm not sure whether it's underground or not, but it was moderately underground. Power line noise was not an issue there, other than the general noise. And that's my early teenage years where I was fighting with all of that and constantly taking the antenna down and putting it back up again and fiddling with it and trying to make it do this, that, and the other. And we were dealing with noise blanking to try to figure out how to get rid of the low-end pulses to be able to hear things. And it was quite a project. Learned quite a lot from it. Actually built my own amplifier to be able to run the 200 watts input from being driven by the Viking Ranger. And it was an interesting process, and it fed on itself. The more I did, the more I wanted to do. And it led to some interesting things later in my life on 160, as I hadn't really ever thought of going on DxExpeditions because I didn't really have the means to travel to other countries. Then after I went to work for CBS, since I had done some traveling, I'd been to Europe with my grandmother and so on and so forth on a DC-7. And the first trip to Europe, we flew to Copenhagen on SAS on a DC-7. Anyway, so I had at least some foreign experience. And after, I don't remember, must have been the very early 90s at working at KCBS, they were constantly looking for people to support the network news operations in complex places in foreign countries and so on. And they invited me on. I don't even remember what the first event I went to locally. There was a stateside activity. And then they offered me an opportunity to go on one of my first trip to the Malta. Yeah. I think Brian and I went to Malta for the Bush-Gorbachev summit. And that took a team of just a whole lot of people, because in that era, yes, there was satellite television services, but you needed a 15-foot dish and a 500-watt transmitter to do news grade satellite uplinks. When they had to haul all that stuff and rent generators and wire everything up and run portable microwave around the island, and that's what we did. And so it was a demonstrably involved operation, and it got me into doing some international trips. So I did a few international trips, and I always threw a radio in my suitcase to see what I could do. And in some cases, I was able to take a few days of vacation and play radio a little bit at the end. And that got me started on doing some DX things. And I can't remember the exact sequence, but I was invited to go along with the Arizona DX Association group, Central Arizona DX group. I think the first one was Myanmar. Anyway, the first group to Myanmar hauled some equipment and had some trouble with it and so on, and decided the second time they were going to go, they wanted to take some people along that knew which end of a soldering iron was hot. And so they offered the trip to me, and I went, and it was a lot of work and a lot of fun. I had the honor of putting the country of Myanmar on 160 meters for the first time in 40 years. And that was in 1990 approximately.
And now this message from ICOM America. Spring is on the air. Get outside with the ICOM ID52A, the industry's first handheld that can send photos over the D-Star network. With the ICOM ID52A, you can call a friend in another city or internationally through the D-Star network with clear digital audio. The ID52A is ICOM's newest handheld amateur radio transceiver that is a VHF UHF dual bander with D-Star and FM dual mode functions. This radio supports conventional FM communications and D-Star simplex, repeater, regional, and worldwide calls over the D-Star Internet Gateway. The ICOM ID52A is the first handheld amateur radio with a full-color 2.3-inch waterfall display and can send photos over the D-Star network with a connected Android device. Other features include wideband receiver with a guaranteed range of 144 to 148 MHz and 440 to 450 MHz. VV, UU, VU with dual DV mode. Integrated GPS GLONASS receiver including grid square location. Micro SD card slot. Micro USB for data transfer, programming, and charging. And it is in an IPX7 waterproof and shockproof case. For more information on this and other amazing ICOM transceivers and accessories, click on the banner ad in this week's show notes page. And when you go to purchase that ICOM IC52A or any other ICOM transceiver, be sure to tell your dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO. So I saw a message that you actually sent on some kind of a group where you were talking about putting out beverage antennas in Myanmar in order to improve the direction of your 160 receive signal anyway. What was the setup there in Myanmar?
That one was the third trip. We went to the Hotel Intercontinental in Yangon. And there's lots of stories associated with that, but the country is operated by a military junta. There is, it's not a democracy. Never has been, and I don't know if it ever will be. But they decided they wanted us, and there was some activity going on that they could say, show the rest of the world how wonderful they were, and so they invited us to come in. Marty Lane, OH2BH, is the one that triggered all that stuff. He's opened up dozens of countries around the world to the connection, to get from his level of connection down to the point where a more normal organized DxExpedition ham group could then figure out how to come in and actually operate an expedition. And all that work. For the first two trips to Myanmar, operating out of the hotel with just a sloper off the roof, but hotels in that part of the world, buildings in that part of the world have a monstrous ground system because of the summertime lightning. And so I had a very good ground running around the roof of this hotel to tie the sloper to, and it worked just fine. A kilowatt into a quarter-wave sloper will make a lot of noise. I tried beverages, but there wasn't any place to put a beverage. It wasn't so much over water that it fundamentally didn't do much good. And we weren't really into loop antennas and so on at that point. It wasn't, some things were not practical. There's a limit, because it was an expedition, so the whole roof of the hotel had 10, 15, 20, 40, and 80 meter antennas on it. And so there were some limits. But I ran a quarter wave of wire down to the ground.
Okay.
And
from the roof.
Tied it off to a tree. And I fed that quarter wave of wire against the hotel ground.
You were actually going from the roof down to the ground.
So the feed point was up on the roof on the 9th story or whatever it was of the hotel. I'd have to go look it up. But it was such that 130 feet or 120 feet of wire at a 30 or 40 degree angle got then far enough away from the ground so that the insulator at the bottom, so that where it converted to rope, was far enough off the ground to where it didn't just suck up all the RF, and it worked very well. It did an excellent job of putting that country up on the air. Then 4 years later, we organized a major expedition. We still had the contacts, and we negotiated for a hotel on an island in the Indian Ocean that was at the very southern tip of the country of Myanmar. It was Myanmar land, but it was about a 10 square mile island off the southern tip of Myanmar, west of Bangkok, in the Indian Ocean. And it was only 1.5 miles or 2 miles off the land, but that's far enough to where we got away from the Asian power line noise. The power lines in Asia are why people survive without getting electrocuted by just walking down the street. Most of us will never understand. They're just an incredible disaster. And power line leaks, they don't worry about that kind of stuff. If there's any power on the other end, that's what they use, and that's the end of the story. But that was XZ0A. The hotel operations were XZ1A, and we did XZ0A for a longer period of time, rented hotel rooms. They had a larger number of operators. And then we had Milt Jensen, and he came equipped, and there's a story behind that one, because my interest in 160 meters is what happened to Milt. I met him on Cactus, as he's from New Mexico, and got him spooled up, not just on Cactus things, but on 160. So we'd arranged for a British expat in Bangkok to get us a bunch of stuff built. So we had a barge haul over 420 feet of tower sections and about 500 feet of aluminum tubing, and built a elevated quarter-wave vertical on 160. We're talking about 150 feet of tower, or 130 feet of tower with the feed point at 50 feet, and then aluminum tubing stinger out the top to tune it to frequency, and a 4-square on 80, and a 4-square on 40, and a 4-square on 30, all out of aluminum tubing with elevated radials and so on and so forth, all over this north lawn of this semi-luxury hotel on this island in the Indian Ocean. And we were there for 3 or 4 weeks. And it was an interesting operation. We learned a lot of things about propagation, and it was also near a solar high, solar maxima, which meant 160 meters was not at its best. Making contacts was not easy, and we learned a lot of things about how to make contacts, and we proved one thing by being there every night with a quarter wave vertical and 1500 watts. And we were there for basically running that for more than 3 weeks, that such a thing as a skew path actually happens. And if you're in the United States and you wanted to hear us and had a directional receive antenna, you best be pointing southwest, because in the path to Myanmar, the Great Circle path to Myanmar is right over the pole for all intents and purposes, depending upon where you are in the country. And there have been lots of debate about, skew paths can't happen, and, well, I heard this way and heard that way. We put that one to bed. Skew paths are real, and they do happen. And we also learned at the Myanmar end, the sunset time period, and you need to have a antenna that is almost an NVIS type antenna, non-vertical, near vertical incident radiation, to hear. As we put out a few beverages that landed suit beverages very well, but we put some out and they helped. But we couldn't hear anything from stateside in the evenings. This was almost impossible. And so we said, well, let's try this. We put out a full-size dipole at 15 feet off the ground, out across through the jungle, and worked 40 stateside stations that night. And it went on from there those signals didn't appear on the beverages until 2 or 3 hours after sunset. And there's lots of discussion over what that process was. And that path, that path is also a skew path. So it's ducted propagation along the gray line is what the bottom line of that is, without going into a whole bunch of gruesome details. But then I guess I might as well finish the 160 story. A few years later, since at that point Milt and I had moderate amount of credibility in the expedition community, we were invited to participate in a more low-band focused but lower bands focused operation to go to Ducie Island. And so we put together with all those people the expedition to Ducie Island. You can look that one up, see what it is. And busted a bunch of records wide open. And, of course, Ducie Island hadn't really been on any of the more exotic bands. It had never been on 160 or 80 before, and at all. And we happened to be there during the CQ160 SSB February contest, made 1.1 million points working people on sideband from there. And that's a record that still stands and is unlikely to be broken for Oceania. Unfortunately, Milt's not with us anymore, so we can't go down and do it. But we put up a Titan-X, it's a 100-foot vertical. So we had to have everything that we could ship in a container to the ship in New Zealand that then could be carried up by the ship up to the island. And we had to build everything and haul the generators in and so on. It's a tents and generators type operation in the tropics. But the thing that made it happen is that Milt and I built a beverage monster. You can make a beverage, if you build a beverage out of ladder line, you can feed it you can feed it in both directions at the same time, and so on. We built 4 directions, and one of them was a pair of phased beverages, staggered 90 degrees. And we built this monster array of beverages all over the island. We're talking about 1,000-foot beverages. And I built a monster switching array, and we came up with enough filters so that the array could be used to receive on 160, 80, and 75 at the same time. You have to remember, in the DX world, 80-meter CW is right at 35-25. Or thereabouts, and the sideband world starts at about 3675 or thereabouts. So we had a very narrow split between the frequencies operated on 80. So we put good enough filters in so that they could operate 80 sideband, 80 CW, 75 sideband, and 160 meters all at the same time off that array of 8 directions worth of beverages, all selected independently. It's so funny. There was very limited crew. We only had 13 people to run 7 stations for 3 weeks. That's an incredible load just on operators, but then there's a rest of living to go along with all of that, and that was quite a strain. So when they first got everything up and running, the guys were poking at us and said, just don't worry about the beverages, just get on the air and operate. And we got the beverage system done. It was about 2 days more before we got it all installed and running. Hooked it up and delivered it to the 80-meter tent and turned the guys loose with it. About 10 minutes later, the guy sticks his head out. Where's the 3-element beam? We never heard a single sound again about why did you spend 2 days of a critical DxExpedition labor time to build that array. and it was like having a monster beam. Particularly the guys from Europe that have really experienced ears, but even they could tell you by switching the beverages around. They could tell you whether the guy was operating from home or whether he was operating from a remote station in a part of the country. We could tell the difference between the East Coast and the West Coast. The system was incredibly directional, and you don't need it on an island like that. There's no noise, except there is a tremendous amount of noise at night, static crashes. And Dietmar would come stumbling out of the 160 tent at dawn, literally blood running out of his ears from listening through static crashes, and shaking his head saying, "No beverages, no contacts."
Amazing. I heard rumors that you had built a remote control 160 station with 4 squares out in the middle of the desert. Did you do that?
Not exactly. It was Milt who built, and this was after VP6DX, when he finally retired for the second time. I'd gone to his house and or Larry's house or whatever over there and operated 160 contests and got them spooled up on it. And they had Milt built a quarter-wave vertical at his house, and then negotiated to put beverages up on the state land nearby. Actually, took a trencher and trenched down the middle of his street, which was dirt, and up around the corner and so on, to run 3,000 feet of feed line up into the country to be able to feed all those beverages, and which got him started on all that kind of stuff. When he retired the second time, he bought some land just across the border into Arizona, and built a 9-circle array, which is considerably more complex than a 4-square. And he built a 9-circle array and plumped a trailer down there to put all the equipment in, and then did operate it remotely, because his second job was Wi-Fi internet transportation in the rural environment. So he knew how to move TCP/IP between places effectively, and he operated that station in many contests remotely. And can't quite visualize what the effect is, but that 9-circle array, when selected to focus in one direction with 1,500 watts of transmitter power, was making more than 20 kilowatts ERP on 160 meters. And that's from antennas whose efficiencies are very high, because they're full-size quarter-wave verticals with large radial systems underneath them, large full-size radial systems. So you're talking about high efficiency and all phased, and the antenna is extremely directional. If he pointed it at you, you were going to hear him. And he had a lot of fun with that. Unfortunately, we lost him to a tower climbing accident a few years later, and that was a severe loss for all of us. But the station still exists. It's not heavily used, but I wasn't involved in it at that point. It was too far away, and there were too many other things going on, particularly in the cactus world, to keep me from having time to spend on it. But that's just 160.
Is that station now? Is it now a club or an organization that maintains?
It's a club that's really just it's 2 or 3 people, and I can't remember what call sign they use with it anymore. I think they tend to use their own. Whoever's operating it uses their own call sign, and I haven't actually been active on 160 much at all, even since VP6DX. Actually, without building a station like Milt built, anything else is a letdown. But there's just too much life going on, and too many things, particularly in the cactus world, going on. And I've never had since I moved out of home. I've never had a home station on HF. All my home station activities have all been on UHF. And in the middle of my time at KCBS, one of the people that I knew very well, Dave Lag, WA6OWD, now W6DL, made a mistake. He said, "We're playing here on X-band. Why don't you see what you can do?" And he handed me basically just a working transverter, and that he'd built up as his first radio. This is in 1990. And so I found a 4-foot dish, and it was left over from what we were doing, because there was a lot of the KCBS stuff was on 13 gigahertz, and that works. The WR75 works just fine on 10 gigahertz. And I found a 4-foot dish with a penny feed, and then started building some pieces to hang on behind it, and came up with a TWT to stick on it, and LNAs, and so on and so forth. And a lot of fun building all that up, and operated it from Mount Wilson for a number of years. And for a long time, I actually operated from atop the water tank there on the KCBS property. And that was in the era long before high stability reference oscillators. And since I could see the folks up north and up and down the coast and so on, I was used as a transfer oscillator a number of times over the years. But I've been active on X-band since 1990, and for all intents and purposes, with one or two exceptions, I've operated in the microwave contests every year since. And that same radio, I only retired just last year. And I've surrounded it with things to make it a high-performance radio, but the guts of the radio were still the old Maycom transverter that he built up. And that got me wound up on X-band. Somewhere I have a picture of my truck with my GMC Envoy, which is a small SUV, with my 6-foot dish. I carried a 6-foot dish on the roof of the truck. I built a framework for it and just clipped it on there and anchored it down. And carried the 4-footer for a while, and then I converted to a 6-footer. Somewhere I have a picture of that truck with the 6-foot dish on the roof and the double spring mount on the side with the 160-meter mobile antenna on it. And that kind of thing tickles my fancy. And, of course, UHF antennas all over the roof of the truck for 440. And the X-band operation, one of the things that I brought to the X-band operation was Cactus, because the folks that were playing on X-band at that time had already figured out that their X-band radios would talk farther than they could figure out a way to do liaison to communicate about it to get themselves lined up. And that was before cell phones were very common at all. And they'd go up to Fraser to set up to try to talk up and down. They'd spend an hour setting up their X-band radio and another 2 hours or another hour setting up a long boom Yagi on 2 meters and a 150-watt 2-meter mobile to try to talk to somebody on sideband far enough away to be able to do liaison. His X-band will out-talk almost anything. And what it doesn't out-talk is Cactus. And once we got the idea across, of course, we made the system available to anybody that was going to operate on it. Once they got the idea across, they never looked back. And they converted that 150-watt 2-meter sideband radio with a big Yagi and a rotor, even if it was an Armstrong rotor. We converted that to a handy-talkie, and so they can pull up and set up their X-band radio and reach in their pocket and grab the HT, and they have full liaison communications throughout the areas that they're going to talk. And sometimes it takes a long haul. The distance records from the West Coast are very significant. I think the terrestrial distance record on the West Coast still exists at 685 miles or some number like that. I'd have to look the number up.
From the Bay Area to Mexico, I think, right?
It was from San Benito, which is a 5,000-foot mountain west of Fresno, basically. Believe it or not, there is a 5,000-foot range of mountains on the west side of the San Joaquin Valley. But in any case, the Mexico part about it is interesting because the guys in Mexico were not in Tijuana. They were 500 miles south of the border in Mexico on the Punta Banda. And there are a couple of interesting stories about that. But what do they use for liaison? Cactus.
I think that when we're talking about X-band, just for the listeners that aren't familiar, what we're talking about is the 10 gigahertz band.
That's right.
You're talking about the 10 gigahertz contest that happens. And I think that you'll find on YouTube, I think, some audio, if not video, of 10 gigahertz operators using Cactus to coordinate their contacts on 10 gigahertz. And I'll put a link in the show notes page for that. Let's go back a little bit. I'm curious, besides your father, who are your Elmers and mentors? Who do you think you learned the most from? Or do you think that the life at Macomco was what kind of really pushed the...
Everything fed on everything. By the time I got to Macomco, I was medium experienced. Looking back at it, I thought I was a lot more experienced than I was, and I had an ear how things should sound and how they sounded, and had an idea how things we'd already done enough remote base operations and trying to make radios talk to each other. And Lynn Cochran designed the first control system that we used. I'm trying to think that we all fed on each other. In the earlier days, on 160, and as a teenager, there were 2-3 guys on 160s that figured out how to put up with a teenager. It was not easy. I was not a pliable teenager, and they finally figured out how to put up with them. Alan Kincaid, W6EIG, was one of them, and they patiently coaxed me through learning about ham radio as well as learning about 160 and so on. And Alan was one of the ones that operated 160 mobiles. Ray K6HIT, HXT. Those calls are. Alan just passed away just recently. His son is on UHF. Roy is long gone, and those two guys were on 160 mobile, and there was Alex. I didn't know Alex very well, but he was every night had a schedule in New Zealand on 160, and that was in the 60s, and that was a tough thing to make happen in that era. But W6KIP, but don't count on that being something you can find, because he's been gone long enough that I don't think you're going to find that call sign traceable to W6 to Alex unless you look if you look in a 1965 call book, you'll find it.
All the call books are online, so you can actually go back almost to the 20s.
Yeah, that I understand. The picking out one person in my pre-Macomco days, pre-remote base days, I'm not sure I can pick out a specific individual. My dad helped me some, and he pointed me at stuff enough. I'm trying to figure out who it was that taught me how to read a schematic. I drove as part of my school history in high school. I didn't get along with school, didn't want to pay attention to it, and ignored them. I was pretty good at test taking, so I survived, but that was all. But while they were talking away, if I'm sitting at my desk, not making a fuss, but drawing schematics of radios, and just a dude that was drawing schematics of multi-stage tube-type radios and figuring out some of the things. I didn't figure out many of the math values. I hadn't quite progressed that far. I understood a little bit of what was going on, but I was lucky. I appeared to have a moderately intuitive understanding of what was trying to take place. And then when the concept of impedance versus resistance finally got through my thick skull, that capacitive reactance and inductive reactance and what they did and how they varied, once that woke up, then it made the rest of it all just happen. I can't say that I can think of a particular individual other than that there were several individuals that were tolerant of a cranky teenager and helped me to get far enough along to be able to figure some things out so I could then keep going. Then, of course, my partner in Cactus, Alan Burgstahler, WA6CDR, was instrumental in focusing some of my attention in some of these areas. He was you and I are the same age for all intents and purposes. Try to remember where I really ran into him. There are several people that are on Cactus that actually knew Alan before I met him, because he lived out in the Palm Desert area for a while, and Dick Morris knew him well, and there was even some QSO cards floating around between them from earlier. And Alan is one of these organized, meticulous guys, and his QSO cards were typed, and everything was sorted and organized. Why he put up with me, I'll never know, because I'm at the other end of the scale. I knew I had to write some stuff down, but I kept most of the stuff in my head.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA30N, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. Let's go back a little bit, Robin, because I think I want to put this in context. Now, for the listeners who keep hearing you refer to Cactus, you're referring to the Cactus Intertie. And I think maybe we should start at the beginning of the Cactus Intertie, like how that evolved into a multi-state, full duplex 420 radio system that still exists to this day. Let's start at the beginning of that, and then we can bring in Alan.
But that is the beginning of that.
So let's talk about that relationship with Alan that led to the Cactus Intertie.
I can't. I'm at this point at my age, I don't have the timing data really straight in my head as to which part of the chicken and egg came first. I've been involved with a small group. The lady I was married to at the time and her brother and were hams, and they and a couple of others, we got involved enough. And Lynn Cochran, they were Cal Poly people. Lynn Cochran, who went on to work for Tektronix, he was the engineer at that point. He designed the first toroid-based, and that Alan became very famous for, because there's a long story behind that we can talk about another time. But the original remote base that we used, I built up a audio system using 64 Cathode followers and Lynn Cochran's controller, and we put that up on Sunset in a building that we helped Fred Daniels build as his first building in the two-way radio business. And so we had a rack in there with an antenna and high performance UHF radio and a kilowatt on 2 meters. And on 4.6 remote base operations. There are a lot of remote base operations in that era.
Explain it to the listeners. That was a UHF repeater connected to a 2-meter or 6-meter base station with some control gear in the middle to make the connections.
Yes, and there's a concept issue that we had a terrible time for 25 years with the FCC to understand, is the 450 radio does 2 jobs simultaneously. It's a 450 repeater, 440 repeater, but that's almost secondary to the fact that it is the control link for the 2-meter station, and that it is the tool by which you not only actually control the mode of the 2-meter radio, but just the act of transmitting at the right place with the right PL tone causes the other transmitter to come on. That's still control. So the UHF radio was a remote base. We classified it as a remote base, which is not a term you'll find in the rules, but it's a remotely controlled station. The 440 is the control link, and the FCC couldn't understand why you would want to run a control link from a mobile. They had a terrible time with that, and there's long stories about how we got them to understand some of this stuff, and the FCC rules modifications that took place around there that created the WR6 repeater calls in the 70s, because we were operating remote bases before that. It used to be much simpler, and it's a concept that has been around. If you can find a physical copy of a license, of an amateur license from 1960, if you look on the back of it, there's a place to fill out the remote control location and address. It right on the back of the license, you can write down the remote control. And in that era, there were station licenses as well as operator licenses. They've done totally away with station license. So we were operating remote operation, but we did it from mobiles as well as fixed stations.
Those remote base stations in the 60s, I think up through the mid-70s, they had Z calls.
Well, only because that's where they fell when we applied for a secondary license. You could get an additional call sign for a remote, for whatever purpose you wanted. You could get an additional call sign as an individual. Later, those converted to, you could get club call signs and do things with them. The WB6SVC, I think, was the first of the remote station call signs that we used. That was the radio on Sunset, which then turned into the WB6TZA when we applied for club calls. And we still hold that call sign. As a matter of fact, we hold a whole bunch of them. There's stories behind that too. But they decided they wanted to do away with the secondary station concept because repeaters were becoming very common, and they wanted to control repeaters. They didn't think we knew how to do it, so they put all kinds of weird things into the rules. And we've been doing this for 20 years at this point. And FCC finally said, but are you sure you know how to do this? How much ERP you got to have from here to there and all the rest? No, come on, that's not how it works. But it was a long struggle to get them to understand that. And in the process, they took away the individual secondary station license. That went away, and was operationally replaced by a club call sign. But in any case, the physical architecture there's a UHF. The best term is mobile relay. The UHF repeater that has a control system attached to it that will then allow you to connect that push-to-talk audio information to a base station or another repeater if you want to, base station on any band. There's a lot of people that remote bases up on 29.6. It was quite common, a lot of fun when the propagation is in. You can talk to people all around the country on 29.6 and from your 440 mobile. And we expanded it fairly rapidly into adding point-to-point links. And some of the early concepts, we did series audio and did a number of things to try to get the audio to come out. When you get more than a couple of radios involved, it gets very complicated very quickly. And we figured all that stuff out. And Alan Burgstahler became involved very early on in that process. And I honestly can't tell you right when, but it would have been 1970. Yeah, 1970. And talk about explosive. We had Josh, the remote base, on Sunset, and we figured out how to run a link down to my house in Pomona, where I had then 3 link radios connected. Link radio is just a duplex radio on 420, but it doesn't repeat. It's A to B and A to B, C, and D, and then B, C, and D back to A, and so on. From my house in Pomona, I was able to make a path to Santa Ynez, and there's a slot there that it sort of works.
Santa Ynez is above Santa Barbara, about 100 miles north.
100 miles north of Pomona, 120 miles from Pomona. And there and over to Palos Verdes, and then through a great fortune, I met a gentleman that was still with us, but he's in his middle 90s now, high 90s now, that was the translator, manager, operator, technical person for the TV translator operations on Santa Rosa Mountain. And he's a ham, and he said, why don't you put something up here? And we did, and the rest is history, because that made all kinds of things possible. And you have to remember, this is tubes. Every single thing in the whole process was tubes, with the exception of the very early controller audio thing was 6C4s, 12.8 and 12.8 AU7s. But as soon as we got out of that and Lynn designed the first RDL controller with toroids, the next generation of that, we built op-amp audio handling and so on to take the discriminator audio out of the receiver and feed it directly into the modulator and get everything to come out. And this is a tube discriminator and a tube modulator. And those have unique issues to accomplish all of that. You have to do that to be able to get the audio to come out right, so you can so what comes out the other end sounds right. And all this time I was working for Macomco, or McFarland Communications at the time, and driving around fixing radios and fixing commercial radio systems, some of which were similar in fundamental design, but without controller aspects and without multi-hop. And I was working on and learning UHF mobiles and base stations and repeaters, and wearing that hat, and then I'd come home and work on our systems, and they were taller enough to let me use the service truck and test equipment to maintain the stuff we were working on. And by 1973, I think, either the end of 1972 or early 1973, we finally finished the connections and talked to Martin off the Mount Franklin radio in El Paso. We had 1,000 miles of RF links in service at that point, all tubes, one end to the other, and VHF mobile relay radios at key sites, at all the sites in between, and really some pretty fantastic amount of coverage at that point. And the system has grown steadily from that beginning of a handful of radios to there's almost 150 radios west of Texas, and then another almost 150 radios in Texas between the two groups there. It's a very large system, and it works. And it still works, and we're still growing it and stabilizing it and expanding it. And it's what occupies almost all of my ham radio energy and has for most of my life. It's Alan Burgstahler was the complete spearhead of the controller. I did RF and audio, and Alan was very competent at RF and audio, but he focused on the controller. And in that era, a controller means that he sits in his apartment in Van Nuys and designs a circuit board, uses his 8x10 projector photograph and film to make a photograph of the board layout, and then he puts photoresist on a circuit board that's a sheet of copper, and then exposes the photoresist through the negative, and then puts the board in an etch bath to etch away the copper that was exposed, leaving the copper behind that's all the traces. And then when you're done, then you sit there with a hand drill or a drill press, and you drill the holes to stick the parts through. We're talking about building boards from scratch.
Well,
they didn't buy a board. There was no such thing as a board shop.
So just to put that in context, one control system, as I remember, that you built for the site above the Palm Springs, that was 4 or 5 22 card cages, almost full to the max. So Alan had a regular manufacturing operation going from soup to nuts in his Van Nuys apartment. You're talking about exposing the board. You couldn't send the boards out to a Chinese house and have them come back like you can now and have them back in a week. Everything from stuffing the boards and testing them and then wiring these card cages with point-to-point wiring on the back of these connectors was an amazingly huge job. There must have been hundreds and hundreds of hours in each one of those control systems.
Oh, very definitely. Alan was the controller expert, both electrically and mechanically. He would take a standard card cage, and what these boards would have on it is whatever electrical element was needed, logic elements or toroids or whatever was necessary. And then the sockets were wire wrap sockets. He would run wire wrap wires around, but before he did that, he had to figure out where the wire had to go. He built an extremely well-documented controller book. Even today, I could go take one of his controller books and open it up and trace a signal through it. It would go pages and pages. We're talking about something that's 4 inches thick in a 3-ring binder that's got the signal routing information and wire routing information and all the things that you need to do. Is he had it in wireless form and in board form. Is the back of this socket has wires that go to here and go to here and go to here. His precision, because he had all of it, he had a system worked out, had labeling on the documentation, so you could open the book and look at it and go trace it through and figure out what was going on. And his precision and documentation and energy made Cactus possible. There's no question about that in my mind. And yes, the controller on Santa Rosa was 4, maybe 5 card cages, but that was not the large. That was one of the early ones. That was not the largest one. The largest regular one was built for the Jack's Peak radio in New Mexico. The guys came out from there and spent a week at Alan's place. He lived in Riverside at that point, and they built the boards and built the controller and hauled it over. It was 101 boards, 101 circuit boards to make the Jack's Peak controller go. And then he built a 10-port switching center switch. It's just for all intents and purposes, a giant 10-port switch. But it had to have all of the controls on it to be able to get it to do things. And you have to bear in mind that there's no chip decoders in that era. So to make a tone decoder, the first receiver has to get the audio out of the discriminator processed and squelched, and the squelch information generated and so on. Then that audio has to then get normalized and put on a bus, and that's fed not only on down across the bus, the boards to all the other ports to then be used or not used as needed, but it also feeds a prefix decoder that was a group filter and a tone decoder, all made out of toroids, 88 millihenry toroids, so that they were big, thick cards, took up 4 or 5 card slots, and you had to do one of those for each receiver. Each receiver got a prefix decoder that the parts on it were hand-wired to be the particular DTMF prefix of that particular site. And then you go to the second receiver, you got to do it all over again. And then there's a main decoder that's got that will decode all the tones, and a decoder selector and all kinds of things to stir all this together. Alan is the one that figured out how to make that all work and built the documentation to make it a viable device. Enormously labor intensive, but there were no choices. There was nothing to buy, and most of the controllers and the telemetry that you are all based on Alan's designs and the things that we worked out. You hear telemetry on a non-Cactus system, it's almost certainly patterned after our telemetry.
Right. If it's on All-Star and it goes beep, that's Alan Burgstahler.
Yeah.
Is the Intertie still expanding? Is it still an active organism that's growing?
Yes. I have to be a little careful about that because we're at a saturation point in terms of trained manpower to do construction work. We've got more projects than we can handle. But The radio system itself is doing fine, and between Cactus and the affiliates, there's 1,400 members or something. I haven't counted. I haven't looked at the recent book to see what the number is. And yes, we're all getting older, and a number of the members either fade away or pass on, and where the number of new people coming along is not all that high. And a lot of the younger people are so accustomed to their cell phone doing whatever it is that they want it to do and giving them a visual readback and doing whatever at the same time. That's a duplex data environment that they don't necessarily quite understand why you'd want to drive around with a mobile and talking on a radio. But it's there. One of the things we've been working steadily and slowly on in the background is we've been working on it for years to make sure that the site agreements, the agreements that we have with whoever owns a building that has allowed us to be in that building with our hand gear, that kind of stuff is committed to paper and organized, and in some cases we actually own the building, and so we've been able to either build a building or buy a building that's no longer needed for its original purpose and then turn it into a ham building, where we then have our own masters, minus the idiocy in the various and sundry federal agencies that regulate that sort of thing. Nothing to do with the FCC. They're not a problem. To sustain the life of the organization, the fundamental right to have the radio equipment has to be sustained. And with this era of conglomerate site ownership that has not the slightest interest in public service or public anything, all they want is their commercial rate, and that's the end of the story. They don't want to talk to hams about anything.
And those commercial rates are based on the number of transmitters.
No, the commercial, not necessarily. They're less concerned about the number of transmitters than what you call it and how much antenna space it uses in their minds, because we had a long tussle with one of the major entities that couldn't get through their head that a 22-foot stick didn't take up 22 feet of tower space, that you could put 12 of them on a cross arm, and then on the backside of the tower, another 12 on a cross arm at the same level. They just treated it as, they're thinking cellular, where a level on the tower has panel antennas all the way around and a monstrous batch of arrays. That's all they want to think about, because that produces large amounts of revenue for them. And the amateur community can't pay anything even faintly resembling commercial rates that generally start at $1,500 a month for one antenna and one transmitter, and then go up as much as they can. You want to put up multiple antennas, they want to charge you multiple rates. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to deal with these people. And in the earlier era, briefly on that subject, many of us had connections through a lot of the people that worked in the two-way radio industry worked for a communications company that built buildings on mountaintops to put repeaters in to sell space on to generate revenue. And your job is to drive up there and fix those radios or fix the mobiles that talk to those radios. And if your boss owns the building and you say, can I use the space over in the corner that nobody's using, you can communicate directly with the guy who is directly impacted by what you want to do. And there were lots and lots of systems that went into buildings owned by a commercial entity that had an employment connection to the person putting the radio in. And it's also, very briefly, one of the reasons that the information about the locations of 440 repeaters, this has happened most on 440, some on other bands, but mostly on 440, is not public information in the coordination world, is that whatever deal has been worked out by an individual with the owner of the building is between him and the owner of the building. The coordinator has to know about it to understand how to deal with it from a frequency coordination standpoint, but it's nobody else's business. And there have been instances in a number of areas and a number of places where the local ham club is so over-impressed with their own importance that they'll go in and pound on this general manager's desk and say, you got this ham gear in your building, we want space in your building for free. That's not how you deal with those people. The result of that is everybody out of the pool. And that's happened over and over again over the years, is that a group of hams will decide that they're important and they treat the building owner like crap. Well, the building owners won't put up with that. As a result, we learned this so early on in the frequency coordination world that the information about who's in what building is private information. End of story.
I remember those days. I remember even stopping at one of the building owners' houses, Jack, as you recall, I won't say a last name,
Mm-hmm.
and sitting with he and his wife and discussing a potential site. And then he gave me the same story that you're giving me, that no matter how much I wanted to pay, it was just too much of a hassle to work with the hams because the hams made trouble on the site. It was a tough lesson to learn in those days. But by the way, it still seems to be the lesson now, in that site owners have the same feelings about, if they even know what ham radio operators are anymore, they have the same feelings about that. We will return to our guests in just a moment. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today.
It's the issue nowadays is there's basically three categories of building owners, or four actually. There's public safety related people, but ignoring that for the moment, is that there still are many sites, and we're in a number of them, that are owned by a communications company that's run by somebody that knows what a radio is and has a business selling services on that in his various buildings and the communications equipment they use to talk to it and so on. But the issue has been that over the years, and the individual you're thinking of did, he sold his many sites to a conglomerate. And that conglomerate is not organized in any fashion that anybody that I've ever found. Two or three very large tower-owning companies in the country. And we haven't never been able to figure their business model out.
They're real estate owners. They could be doing apartments at the same time.
That's in essence, that's true. That's so. Without beating that particular subject to death, but the issue is they have a rate that they want, and they have no It's beyond my comprehension. They would rather have no revenue at all from a building than to allow somebody in it at a rate that is not their full rate.
Right.
And I don't understand that business model.
Because they can get it from a cellular operator that comes in. As long as they can get it, or maybe they're applying a rate card across an entire country. Let's change the subject a little bit, because you're talking about the Cactus Intertie, and I bring this up a lot, and listeners are probably saying, oh, Eric is going to go off on this tangent again. But how are you as an organization creating younger members that have your skill sets to be able to maintain these very complicated systems?
That's unfortunately a good question, because we kind of sort of aren't. I don't have a meaningful answer. There are some people that we would bring along, and some of them are interested in participating to the degree of learning and getting involved in how things work and why. There are, of the younger people, there are not many that want to take the time to learn about how we do this and why we do it, because the cell phone is so ubiquitous at this point that the interest in ham radio in general is minimized. And for a complex system like this, it's even more minimized. It's difficult to manage. It's difficult to manage that. And then when you plug in the cranky old man factor for a number of us, it gets even more difficult. And just taking somebody along when you go to a mountaintop to work on a radio, that isn't necessarily all that easy to accomplish, both physically and in reality, because in a lot of these cases, it's an expedition. You don't just get in your car and drive to where the radio is and then come home. You're gone for over a 14-hour day or overnight or whatever. And a lot of the places are not accessible to an ordinary car. You're not going to get a green vehicle to 40% of our sites. Physically won't get there. And that presents mechanical problems. Also, just to be narrow about it, I've just barely got the energy necessary to go to the site and do the things that I think need to be done. And it takes somebody that's got more interest and more tolerance than most of us have to then go along and try to figure out what is being done and said when the guy that's showing you the thing shows you and just doesn't really have the time to turn it into a training session. If the purpose of the trip is a training session, that's different, because then you can focus on training and explaining and understanding, take the working system and go through all the setups and whatever else is going on. We do that, but it doesn't happen very often. Doesn't happen very often. It is a serious problem, not a minor problem.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
My personal focus on 440 and X-band is sufficiently narrow. That's a problem. The digital modes are interesting. There's some things that I'm uncomfortable with about in terms of I don't want the term I was going to use was communications integrity. That's not what I'm saying. It's not a matter of somebody's doing something wrong. I don't want to go there at all, because that's not the case. That the data stream that's being interpreted is based on so much prediction and so little actual data transfer that it makes me wonder sometimes how useful it really is. But it does seem to actually convey some data. I just have some doubts about that. But that's part of the growth process. And the only way you're going to find out whether or not the Q65 is better than Q60 FT8 or whatever is to actually do it. That's what amateur radio is about, is go put it together and make it work and then figure out how it fits into what you're trying to accomplish. And there's so many different things that you can try to accomplish. And the biggest problem that we have now is getting the try to accomplish into an environment where some success is possible, because you take somebody that's accustomed to just opening his cell phone and punching in something and getting what he wants, or talking to his cell phone and he punch anything, and that when it's now you've got to spend 30 minutes fiddling around with things to try to understand what's going on so that you can then communicate, that leaves the interest in values down pretty far. That concerns me. As far as where we're going, I'm not the best judge of that, because I've just, like I say, my personal focus is pretty narrow, and that's not good. I'd like to be able to train people in what I know about what's going on. And there are people that are coming along that can get involved and do some of that, but they're pretty rare, and it's a problem that I'm concerned about. Amateur radio's dependency on that RJ45 connector and its associated Wi-Fi, that when you can literally pick up your phone, punch a couple of buttons on your phone, and be connected to an amateur radio station in Estonia and operate it all on cellular data, that there's the interest in establishing communications with that station in Estonia. So what? I've been thinking a little bit about this, and the biggest area that I think that amateur radio needs to focus is really in the general category of emergency communications, and that is very broad. One of the things that we as a society these days are not doing well with at all is understanding what tools are available to us when picking up the phone and dialing 911 and then standing there waiting for somebody to show up to solve your problem doesn't work.
When it doesn't work, you mean?
Yep. When you can't do that, it doesn't matter what you can make a list of 100 things that can go on that can cause you to be unable to use your nice fancy smartphone to solve your problem.
Like, for example, the Paradise Fire is a great example, right? Those fiber optic cables were above ground, went through the trees, the fire came in, melted them down, and everything went down. And so there were no smartphones available to work instantly.
There were no smartphones available. There was nothing that would work except two-way radios.
Right.
And that were then based on base stations that had generator power or whatever, and or mobiles and portables. And the portables needed ways to be charged and so on. The biggest problem that we have, I see it, is that the general citizenry is not accustomed to thinking in terms of, if something goes wrong, what do I do? They've been trained that if something goes wrong, pick up your smartphone and push button A or button B or 911 or whatever the appropriate thing is, or push a button and your smartphone will tell you, this is this kind of an event, so you do this.
And those apps are totally dependent on TCP/IP connection through the LTE or 3G or 4G or whatever, and if that doesn't exist, even those apps don't work.
Absolutely correct. And we have the problem that, like with our electronic cars these days, I don't mean electric powered, I'm talking about computer managed vehicles. Something goes wrong, most people have no clue what to do about it. They just have to wait for somebody to fix it. And there are going to be times and places and circumstances, and it's really unfortunate that we're getting a very firsthand. The Western countries, are getting a secondhand lesson, but the current troubles in Ukraine lesson that we need to be learning, and amateur radio operators in general need to learn that as an individual, what do you do when things don't work? The infrastructure that you're accustomed to doesn't work. And the people that have access to a tool that is not based on that infrastructure are amateur radio operators.
Right. In Jerusalem, there are neighborhoods that have emergency centers, and those centers have a box of portable radios. And while the amateurs we're not really called upon for anything, what we can be called upon is we actually know how to take those portable radios out of the package, put them in chargers, put the antennas on them, when frankly, most people have no clue. So our expertise is valuable, even if it's not applied directly to amateur radio.
And what you have there is actually more organized than we have here, but those things do exist. We need to understand them. As amateur radio operators, we need to know enough about what's around us to figure out what to make use of and how to make use of it effectively. There's some MCOM training, yes, but that's even somewhat specialized. But as a ham radio operator, that all that stuff that is around, if you have a little bit of an understanding as to what it does, you can make something work. And when it all falls apart, that HF station that you have that sits there and works the world with a computer with FT8 while you watch in the background, you can use that for something else. And you may find that you need to. When we need to value ourselves to our community, I don't have a good answer.
Robin, it's a great question. It's a question that we're not asking enough. And so asking the question, I think, is as important as having the answer, because it will get us to start thinking.
Yes, indeed. And one of the things that we do, as Cactus Intertie, is that we're trying to maintain a system that is not dependent on the public infrastructure. And there are some places that use TCP/IP over the internet to get a long haul handled in a special way. But the vast majority of our stuff is our own connection. It doesn't matter whether it's TCP/IP. It matters that the hardware is independent of the public structure. And it's independent of the commercial server. It's independent of almost everything except the physical presence of the building and power. And in a lot of cases, we'll put in batteries or solar power or whatever. That's the area we're working on now, is to try to harden the value of our system so that when the more common types of public emergencies go on, like that fire, is that the radio system will continue to function, because it didn't get burned up in the cables and the power lines running through the city. Yeah, it doesn't have power, but we've got solar power or batteries to last for a while until somebody can get there to run a generator, whatever. And we need to be able to do that and then provide some communications tools with it. And we have connections with the state of California their Office of Emergency Services, that the ham group that's associated with them makes use of our system on a regular basis for nets. They at least now know that the system is there and if something goes wrong, they show up. The biggest communications problem we're faced with is wildfires in California. But the cellular systems will keep working for a while, but they'll run out of battery and they get overloaded. And something that the public is not aware of and needs to understand is real and necessary is the cellular systems, all of them, prioritize, and communications requests made by a device, the device identifies itself to the cellular system, and the cellular system assigns it a priority. In normal operations, that you never know, it's a non-issue. The capacity is there. When the capacity becomes limited, that priority has an effect. And all of a sudden, your cell phone doesn't make phone calls because somebody with higher priority than you is taking what little bandwidth there is left. And then is when you go over and you pick up the microphone on your radio and you call somebody that's in a district 50 miles away, that can handle your traffic for you.
Do Cactus Intertie members have an organized emergency drills so that members actually know how to handle emergency traffic in the case that it would be needed at some point?
The direct answer to your question is no. The general answer to your question is yes, because there are nets every week operated by the state OES people that are hams, that are, many of them are also Cactus members, that are oriented rather. What we offer in terms of communications tools to OES is a long-haul communications capability. There's lots of local repeaters. Some of them will go away in an emergency, or they'll run out of power or whatever. Some of them are in places where there's generators, but there's lots and lots of local repeaters to handle local traffic. We don't pretend to handle local traffic, but those people have an organized structure, and they've learned to make use of the system to a reasonable degree. The members of the system that are competent at manipulating the structure of the system would be able to show up and assist in terms of segmenting out issues or whatever else might be going on that's needed. But no, we don't have, and it's a point that I got to think about how we can do it to have it mean something, is what to do when something goes wrong. Most people are, as we've discussed, when something goes wrong, they pick up their cell phone, and that's okay, except that's one string to your bow. And I still have a wired landline at my house, even though I'm spending a serious amount of money to pay to have telephone service delivered to me on a wire. But that wire works when the cable company stops working, and it's an independent path. Is it perfect? No, certainly isn't. But it's different, and it gets its power from the batteries in the phone company office and things like that. We need to get our members and expand our interface with the OES people as to when something serious happens, what are we going to do with this tool, and how is it best used? If every single member of the system showed up on the radio at the same time, there would be a problem. It's pretty resilient about that sort of thing because it's a full duplex system. It's one of the biggest advantages of it, but there needs to be order out of the chaos, and we don't really have a mechanism for that because it's not needed on a normal basis. And even in the case of a earthquake emergency that's not the San Andreas with half of California falling into the ocean, but just a localized earthquake, or even a wildfire, it's moderately localized. The impacts of it are moderately localized, and the traffic handling capability of the local repeaters, what cell service is still available, and so on, and then interregional on our system, the tools are there, and some people use them. We do need to figure out a better way to make it so that 12 hours or 24 hours later, when other services start to quit, that we know what to do with our tools. That's the best thing that we can do to contribute. As an amateur in general, you need to know what to do with the tools that you have to make them useful in an emergency. In a longer-term, significant emergency, the local public safety agencies don't need a bunch of hams calling up and say, I got my radio sitting here, who do you want me to talk to? That doesn't work. They're already busy dealing with things. But they need to know that they've got somebody they can call. Each of the cities has got something going on, and in terms of an amateur radio connection of some sort. But it's not heavily organized in terms of all of the amateurs in an area have the capability to do something and an understanding of what to do with the capabilities. We need to be looking at that, figuring out what to do.
I see, Robin, that there's a couple of opportunities here. I always like to look for opportunities. One of those opportunities is maybe to go back to Cal Poly Pomona or another institution and actually create, with a membership from the Cactus Intertie or from other repeater organizations, to actually create a hands-on course. Maybe that course is accredited, maybe it leads to employment in a whole host of companies, from broadcasters like KCBS to companies like General Dynamics. That's where we started. It seems like we're going to go full circle. And that is to create this hands-on expertise. And maybe that needs to come from someplace. Maybe it doesn't come from Robin Critchell, but maybe it comes from younger members who see the need for people with experience to be able to maintain systems like this, because that experience also means that you can fix anything else. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, that concept has meaning. I wouldn't necessarily be a very good person to be directly involved in that, but the principle seems reasonable. The biggest problem that I perceive is the fundamental rejection from lots of companies, KCBS being one of them, that their whole concept of how to make things work is do it cheap and stop spending money on whatever it is. That's the first rule. And what do you do when it doesn't work is not a part of it. And it's a serious mistake. And a number of corporate America structures are not paying, and I think it's really worldwide, they're so focused on immediate revenue creation that they're not willing to recognize that they have a functional obligation, if nothing else, to their shareholders to be able to function when things don't work. Is they can't just stop reporting the news, because a lot of the stuff out there today is using aggregated cellular data packages to handle their video. And if the cellular data system gets overloaded or stops working, it doesn't matter why, they just all stand around and stare at each other and say, what do I do now? They have an infrastructure that's been built over the years to support some of that stuff on an independent basis, but they don't want it to continue. They want it to go away because it costs money. And we as a society are heavily focused on keeping things on the status quo being good, and that the status quo will always be quo. And
right.
It's an unhealthy combination, and we're likely to pay for it.
Well, I think we don't realize electric infrastructure, water and sewage infrastructure, gas pipeline infrastructure, if there still will be gas pipelines in the future. It's my understanding that Electric Workers of America, that they're short over 100,000 electric workers who can actually work on systems, subsystems, transmission lines, distribution, and those jobs are available in America, but people aren't taking those jobs. We depend upon all of this infrastructure to have the standard of living that we have, and yet there aren't young people going into these professions to keep that infrastructure up and running. It's a serious problem. I see that my amateur radio background has allowed me to be able to fix just about anything. And therefore it's been very valuable to me over my life. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. One of the things is, you're in the IT world. One of the things you have to do in the IT world, and there's a lot of people that don't, is understand the fundamental concept of troubleshooting. When it goes wrong, what went wrong, and how do you figure out what went wrong? Walking up to a computer and saying, hey, computer, what went wrong with you, whether you do it with your fingers or your voice, that's not good enough. You need, when it stops working, you got to figure out why it stopped working and how to get it working again quickly. Just in a general state of affairs, your experience with a variety of communications tools is the IT world is still communications, even if they don't want to admit it. You're sending information from point A to point B, and you want it to get there. And when it stops, the skills that you've learned about how radios in general, but communications tools specifically work, gives you the skill to analyze what's wrong and figure out how to fix it. And we're teaching the upcoming generations to be dependent upon their cell phone to ask it a question and say, it'll tell me, as Alexa or Siri or whatever will tell you what the problem is and what to do about it. And that is a dangerous combination. One of the places that we need to go to fix some of this is at the college level, and to some degree at the high school level early on, is to figure out how to get the existing culture that's being taught and the people teaching it to understand that this is not an ivory tower world we live in.
Yeah, it's a very fragile world that we live in. Robin, I know that it's taken 6 years to get you on the show, and you perhaps thought you didn't have anything to talk about, but I want to publicly recognize I had two Elmers growing up as a ham radio operator. You were one of those Elmers. Listening to you talk, and frankly, the listeners now have the opportunity to hear you. This is how I learned about ham radio and repeaters and control systems and all that stuff. My other Elmer, who was practical for me, where I was actually riding with him and fixing stuff, was Mike Klein, WA6VLD. I knew Alan Burgstahler from riding with him one time to an amateur radio convention up the coast. I think it was up in the Bay Area, and we had a chance to get to know each other. So I had you and the people I listened to on the radio and actual experience with Mike that taught me all the things that laid the foundations for me to do what I did in my adult life. For that, I want to thank you. You probably didn't know that you had that kind of impact, but you did. And I know now that the listeners to the QSO Today podcast will know exactly why. So with that, I want to thank you so much, Robin, and wish you 73, and thank you for joining me on the QSO Today podcast.
Glad to have a chance to talk with you, Eric. It's been a long time.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Robin. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in WA6CDR in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to ICOM America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of ICOM America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.